Tonight at 10, Rishi Sunak's immigration minister resigns, saying the government's plans to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda won't work. Robert Jenrick left government just as it was introducing legislation to try to kickstart its Rwanda policy after the Supreme Court ruled it unlawful. We'll be looking at what this means for Rishi Sunak's asylum policy and how exposed this leaves him politically. Also on the programme tonight.
We should collectively have twigged much sooner. I should have twigged.
Boris Johnson says he underestimated the scale of the challenge as he gave evidence to the COVID inquiry. We have a special report from South Korea about conditions in the north from a family who managed to flee despite the border being sealed. And new balls for golf's biggest hitters to stop them from travelling so far.
On BBC London, tributes to Leanne Gordon, a beautiful soul shot dead in Hackney last night. A teenage boy and 20-year-old man were also injured.
Good evening. In a major blow to the Prime Minister tonight, the minister responsible for immigration, Robert Jenrick, has resigned. At the very moment legislation on asylum seekers was being announced to the Commons. His resignation came over a bill attempting to enable the government's policy of sending some migrants to Rwanda to go ahead after the Supreme Court ruled it unlawful. Mr. Jenrick said it didn't go far enough and it would not end what he called the merry-go-round of legal challenges which risked paralysing the scheme. Well, our political editor, Chris Mason, is here with me. And Chris, a huge embarrassment this for Rishi Sunak.
It is a huge embarrassment, Rita, because it's always awkward for a Prime Minister to lose a minister because they disagree with government policy. But quite the thing to do so in the very week you're attempting a reset on, yes, you guessed it, immigration policy. On Monday, we heard the government's plans to cut legal immigration. Yesterday, the Home Secretary James Cleverly went to Rwanda to set out part of the approach on illegal immigration. I went along too to report on it, and as day trips go, it's quite the journey. But as that trip was underway, the immigration minister of all people was seeing the Prime Minister to tell him he'd concluded the reworked Rwanda plan was close to hopeless. Here is our political correspondent, Leila Nathu.
In Downing Street on Tuesday, Robert Jenrick seemed uncertain about the future of his flagship policy.
Hello. Can the flights now take off?
Tonight, he quit as immigration minister, saying a new law designed to ensure some asylum seekers could be sent to Rwanda didn't go far enough. In his resignation letter to the Prime Minister, Mr. Jenrick says, "A bill of the kind you are proposing is a triumph of hope over experience. The stakes for the country are too high for us not to pursue the stronger protections required to end the merry-go-round of legal challenges." He goes on to say, "I refuse to be yet another politician who makes promises on immigration to the British public but does not keep them."
Statement, Home Secretary.
In the Commons, meanwhile, his former boss was selling the government's revised plan to stop the boats.
It is a bill which is lawful, it is fair, and it is necessary, because people will only stop coming here illegally when they know that they cannot stay here and that they will be detained and quickly removed to a safe third country.
The new legislation aims to declare Rwanda a safe country and to prevent removals being stopped by the courts. Sections of existing UK human rights law won't apply. Routes to individual legal challenges will be limited, and ministers will be able to override any rulings from the European Court of Human Rights.
Sir John Hayes.
Some Tory MPs have called for all international legal obligations to be disregarded.
Will he confirm that the provisions in this bill are sufficient to resist individual challenges from those who might be sent to Rwanda and the interest groups and the deluded dodgy lawyers who support them?
Labour said the government was in chaos.
This is the desperate, dying days of a party ripping itself apart, clearly totally out of ideas, lost any sense of leadership or direction.
Rishi Sunak has been trying to balance the competing demands of different wings of his party while trying to rescue the policy at the heart of his promise to stop channel crossings. In trying to bolster the Rwanda plan, he's lost the very minister who's been in charge of it, who now says the scheme as it stands won't work and warned the fortunes of the Conservative Party are now at stake. Leila Nathu, BBC News in Westminster.
Well, we'll hear from Chris Mason again in just a moment, but first we're joined by our legal correspondent Dominic Casciani. And Dom, just talk us through what the government wants to do with this bill.
Well, Rita, it's not a very long bill, but it's pretty complicated and a lot of it is pretty unprecedented in the direction it's going. And the most important statement in that is where it says that every decision maker, meaning from the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary through to every judge, must conclusively treat Rwanda as a safe country. Now, in legal terms, the critics of the government are saying, given the evidence that Rwanda is not a safe country when it comes to the treatment of asylum seekers, that's the equivalent of saying 2 + 2 = 5. And they say in those terms, this is basically heading for an enormous legal battle. I think the really important issue for this, and what is concerning a lot of people tonight, is that the bill makes clear that this should go ahead, notwithstanding the fact that there are other British laws which stand in the way of the Rwanda plan. There are international laws which stand in the way of the Rwanda plan. Two, for example, being the Refugee Convention, which sets out minimum standards for the treatment of refugees. Another being the UN Convention Against Torture. If this bill tells judges to effectively ignore those laws, that potentially sets up a clash where the Supreme Court may eventually say this is incompatible with human rights law. That possibly then ends in a battle in Strasbourg. You can see how political it's going to get. And that's why tonight you have a lot of critics, including a lot of lawyers, are saying, why are two key figures, Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, and the Attorney General, still supporting this piece of legislation?
And Chris, how dangerous a moment is this for Rishi Sunak with this resignation?
It is dangerous. It's dangerous because of the policy itself. So we've seen a letter tonight from Mr Sunak to Mr Jenrick saying that he claims that this is the toughest piece of illegal migration legislation ever put forward by a UK government, and argues that the government couldn't have gone further because the Rwandan government had said it didn't want the UK to go further. And Rwanda has said publicly tonight that anything the UK does has to be compatible with international law. It gives you a sense, as Dominic was saying, that the government's trying to find a navigable path that works legally, practically and politically to try and progress the Rwanda policy, and they are struggling. Then there is the bigger picture. Hundreds of Conservative MPs and millions of voters want to see things done on migration. That's why you've seen these policy announcements from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's big selling point a year ago to his party and to the country was that he had put a cork on the chaos of what had gone before with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. That cork feels like it's whizzing over the garden fence when things like the events of tonight happen. One senior Conservative said to me tonight, I don't think that Rishi Sunak would lose a vote of confidence, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was one. And another said there's loads of Conservative MPs who feel they've got nothing to lose, and so they are willing to contemplate any option, and also thought a confidence vote could happen by accident. Now, there is often loads of talk of this kind of thing, and it never comes to something, but it is a measure of the mood, and the mood in the Conservative Party is bleak.
Chris, Dominic, thank you both very much. Boris Johnson has apologised at the COVID inquiry for the way the government handled the pandemic, saying it had underestimated the challenge. During around 6 hours of evidence, he admitted he should have realised sooner how serious the situation was and said he was sorry for the pain, loss and suffering of victims and families. Much of today focused on the start of the pandemic and the timing of COVID measures. The UK announced a lockdown on March the 23rd, 2020. That first lockdown stayed in place until June. Boris Johnson then put England into a second full lockdown in November of the same year, as well as a third full lockdown in January 2021. Our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young sent this report.
A lot has been said by a lot of people about Boris Johnson's time in Number 10. He was confronted by the biggest challenge to face a Prime Minister in peacetime. Not just a health crisis, but an economic one too. He's been accused of acting too late and of lying about what went on here.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
This was Mr Johnson's chance to give his side of the story, and he began with an apology.
Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering
sit down.
Of
please,
the
stop.
COVID victims.
Please sit down. Right, ushers, please, could you ask them to leave?
These were the 4 women thrown out for interrupting and said they'd never accept Mr Johnson's apology.
11 municipalities in Italy.
Back inside, questions about February 2020. Coronavirus had spread to Italy and the cabinet had discussed what plans were in place here.
I look at all this stuff in which we seem so oblivious with horror now. I mean, we should have twigged. We should collectively have twigged much sooner. I should have twigged.
When the seriousness of the virus was understood, it led to this lockdown. Several former colleagues described Mr Johnson as indecisive. He says he was weighing up difficult options.
I've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer with me saying that there's a risk to the UK bond markets and our ability to raise sovereign debt. This matters massively to people in this country. I have to go through the arguments, and that is what I was doing.
Did you consider the argument against lockdown, or did you?
I'm afraid to say at that stage I gave it pretty short shrift, because I thought that my job was to protect human life. I had no other tool, literally nothing else.
There were some uncomfortable questions about the culture in Number 10. Former Chief Advisor Dominic Cummings wrote sweary messages criticising colleagues, including his boss.
I knew that some people were difficult. I didn't know how difficult they were, clearly. But I thought it was better on the whole for the country to have a disputatious culture in Number 10 than one that was quietly acquiescent.
That was certainly a positive spin on a workplace atmosphere many described as toxic. And Boris Johnson seemed emotional as he reflected on the first year of the pandemic.
We have to be realistic about 2020, the whole year, that whole tragic year. We did lock down, but then it bounced back after we'd unlocked.
Today, Boris Johnson denied that he failed to show leadership during the pandemic. He said it wasn't indecisiveness, he was simply weighing up options that all had terrible downsides. He did admit that mistakes were made, but said it was a collective failure. Scientists, politicians and officials all underestimating how serious the pandemic was.
Boris Johnson will be back here tomorrow to give further evidence. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, there were families and campaigners inside and outside the COVID inquiry today. Our health editor Hugh Pym spoke to some of them about Boris Johnson's evidence.
I have cognitive issues. I find it difficult to walk very far without having to rest or I collapse. But today is so important.
I've come from South London today. I'm here primarily for my dad.
Jean and Anthony, both at the inquiry today, have lost so much in different ways because of COVID-19. Jean's father died in April 2020 in a care home after getting the virus. Anthony was a war correspondent, but now because of long COVID, every day is a struggle. He can no longer work. Outside the inquiry, they met others who've lost loved ones or suffered with the lasting consequences of the virus.
The scenes from Italy really rattled me.
At a distance, Jim, who's a consultant, is watching the inquiry in breaks from his hospital shift.
If you look at our ITU, there are 2 non-corona patients.
Working in intensive care in the first wave of COVID, he had to help manage the surge of seriously ill patients.
Listening to Boris Johnson, that build-up period, from my perspective, we were desperate for the lockdown. We were terrified that we were going to be overrun with patients and that we would be put into the most awful ethical situations.
Was it Matt Hancock last week?
Having heard Boris Johnson, Jean was sceptical about the explanations of decisions on lockdowns.
He made reference to the scientists quite a few times. Well, they didn't say anything. Behavioural fatigue and bounce back and, and that's why they delayed locking down. So he's almost pushing the blame onto the scientists, and absolving himself of that responsibility as Prime Minister to make those decisions.
Anthony and his wife are both living with the continuing symptoms known as long COVID.
It has taken everything we hold dear from us. We've lost everything. We exist now on benefits for all of our income.
So what did he make of Boris Johnson's apology?
They're words, aren't they? It makes a headline, Boris says sorry, but what does it change?
There's no doubt this is a highly significant day for campaigners, but there'll be more to come when the inquiry in its later stages looks in more detail at the response of the NHS to the COVID crisis and what happened in care homes.
Jean will be coming back when Rishi Sunak gives evidence. For Anthony, the physical effort of getting there may be too much. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
The government has stopped short of giving Hillsborough campaigners the law they want as it finally published its response to a report about the disaster in 1989. 97 Liverpool fans died following a crush in what was Britain's worst sporting tragedy. The government admitted its response to the report, produced 6 years ago, took too long, but it won't introduce one of the key recommendations, a so-called Hillsborough law, which would have forced all public servants to cooperate with inquiries. Judith Moritz reports.
Well, this is not the scene that we wanted to see on semi-final day.
Hillsborough is a disaster which is still going on. It's nearly 35 years since the crush which claimed 97 lives. But ask the survivors and the families of those who died, and they'll tell you they continue to feel let down. The former Bishop of Liverpool, James Jones, wrote a report about their experiences 6 years ago. Today, the government published its response. But Jenny, Debbie and Deanna, who all lost relatives at Hillsborough, all say it's too little, too late.
It doesn't go far enough. There are too many recommendations, too many consultations still to come, and not enough legal statutory duty. To me, it's like, oh gosh, we're getting criticised about not having the response out there already and the length of time it's taken, and they've just cobbled it together.
It needs to be statute law, really, and when they're talking about duty of candour with the police, it's not just the police, it's everybody.
I think I've lost count of the number of Home Secretaries that the Bishop James's report passed the desk of, and between all of them, this is the best that they can come up with. And the sorry state of affairs is, if Hillsborough happens again tomorrow, families involved in it would have to go through exactly the same thing that we have, so they have failed.
The government hasn't endorsed a Hillsborough law, which would make it illegal for all public officials to withhold information, arguing that elements of the legislation already exist. It says it will consult on improving financial support for families' legal costs at inquests, and it has signed a voluntary Hillsborough Charter.
Other signatories of the Charter include the National Police Chiefs Council on behalf of all 43 police forces, the College of Policing, the Crown Prosecution Service, the National Fire Chiefs Council and others. We want this charter to become part of the culture of what it means to be a public servant in Britain.
The time it's taken for the government to respond has become as much a feature of the exercise as the response itself. Today, ministers accepted that the delay has compounded the Hillsborough family's agony, given that the very purpose of the Bishop's original report was to prevent further suffering. That might be seen as particularly unfortunate.
Although the government's statement falls short of the hopes of the Hillsborough families, it is a serious and substantial response to my report. I welcome the government's decision to sign the Charter for those bereaved through public tragedy. It now puts the rights of the bereaved above public authorities protecting their own reputations.
The Bishop has urged the government to extend its response to include a Hillsborough law, and bereaved families and survivors say they'll continue to campaign for it as a legacy after their years of struggle. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Liverpool.
The UN's human rights chief says that Palestinians are living in utter, deepening horror. The UN says that 600,000 people are under evacuation orders in southern Gaza, but there is nowhere to go. Israel has carried out more heavy aerial bombardment across Gaza in its fight against Hamas, designated a terrorist organisation by the UK. And the fighting on the ground has intensified in the south, particularly around the city of Khan Yunis. Our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, reports now on the growing humanitarian crisis.
More Palestinian civilians fled south towards the Egyptian border after Israel declared a brief pause in combat operations. Almost 2 million Gazans have fled their homes. Israel says it is killing fewer civilians, as the US has requested. The United Nations says nowhere in this tiny territory is safe. Hamadan al-Turabin offers people lifts. He said he's seen casualties in the streets with legs or heads blown off and no one can reach them. The stream of misery entering the hospital in Khan Yunis does not stop, and neither is growing condemnation from international relief agencies of the pain and death Israel is inflicting on Gaza's civilians. It's one of the worst assaults on any civilian population in our time and age, according to the Norwegian Refugee Council. As Israel's forces push south, their leaders reject that outright. The damage and death, they say, is the fault of Hamas for starting this war. Israel has given out video of captured weapons it says were found near schools and clinics. More proof, the army insists, that Hamas uses civilians as human shields. In Jerusalem, Lynn Hastings, a senior UN official, said Hamas attacks on Israel were horrific and atrocious, but now Israel has obligations.
There are allegations, that the UN isn't doing enough, but it's up to the government of Israel to let us do enough. And right now the conditions inside of Gaza are not permitting us to do our job and to deliver humanitarian assistance.
Should the Israelis examine their conscience?
I think we should all be examining our conscience in terms of what's going on in Gaza, and you will have heard many people say, have we actually lost our humanity in this crisis?
Do you think we have?
I think some of us have, maybe, yeah. I think not. I think the world is not doing enough to end this.
Israel could end it tomorrow.
They could indeed.
And in Gaza, another dead child gets a last kiss. The BBC freelance who filmed this mass funeral reported it followed an Israeli strike on Deir al-Balach that killed 47, including 15 children. 9 people are still under the rubble. Israel says only force will destroy Hamas and save its hostages. But the Americans have warned Israel that fighting the war this way, killing so many civilians, risks driving Palestinians into the arms of Hamas. And for Israel, that would be a strategic defeat. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Jerusalem.
This is the BBC's Adnan El Bash, one of the few journalists left in Gaza still reporting for an international news organisation. He's been telling us about life there now and the terrible dilemmas that he's facing.
Life is closing in on me. This is the first time I feel completely lost. All willpower and control has been ripped from me. I'm used to keeping my family safe and secure. Now I am torn by indecision. Should I go to Rafah, keeping working and hope my family will be okay? Or should I try to get back to them, stop reporting, and if it comes to the worst, at least we die together?
Well, Adnan is writing regular updates for BBC News Online. You can read them and also follow the latest developments on the Israel-Gaza war on the BBC News website. A North Korean family has told the BBC that there's been a great deal of suffering since the country sealed its borders at the start of the pandemic. Defections, which were once fairly common, have become almost impossible. This family fled by sea and is the first to have escaped this year and made it to the south. One family member spoke to our correspondent in Seoul, Jean Mackenzie. We've revoiced his words and are not using his full name to help protect the family. Although we can't independently verify all of his accounts, some of the details are in line with what we've been told by other sources.
Every escape from North Korea is remarkable. But Mr. Kim took a stomach-churning risk. With the borders sealed because of the pandemic, he fled by sea with his entire family on board this ship. His wife pregnant, his brother's young children hidden below the deck.
We put the children to sleep with sleeping pills and hid them in grain sacks. I was almost paralyzed by fear. I knew my entire family could be executed if I made one mistake. The boat was very loud, but all I could hear was my heartbeat.
The family crossed into South Korean waters undetected and were rescued by the Navy. With defections now at a trickle, they'd pulled off the seemingly impossible. This is the sea between North and South Korea, where Mr. Kim's family crossed. It is so unusual for escapees to come this way directly to South Korea. Most go through China, meaning Mr. Kim and his family are the first to have escaped this year and made it here. And so their testimony is so important because it's some of the most up-to-date information we have about what's happening in the country. The border closures have brought immense suffering, he told me. 2 farmers he knew starved to death as food prices soared, while the pandemic restrictions made life more desperate.
When there were cases of COVID, everyone would be locked up and the entire area sealed off. The people inside had little or nothing to eat. After they had starved for a while, the government would bring in truckloads of supplies to sell, so people would praise them. It's like starving your baby, then giving it a small amount so it would thank you. People started asking whether this was the state's plan to profit from the pandemic.
Now safely in Seoul, and these streets aren't as unfamiliar as they should be. Mr. Kim grew up watching South Korean television in secret. This, like for so many, was his source of enlightenment. But now he says the authorities are ruthlessly cracking down on anyone caught watching it.
People started calling the crackdown officials mosquitoes, like vampires sucking out our blood. They're ruthless. They'll shoot you, kill you, or send you to a labor camp. Last year, they publicly executed a 22-year-old man for listening to South Korean songs and sharing them with his friends. They said they were punishing him harshly to set the right precedent. Everyone is afraid.
In South Korea, the government has criticized its neighbor for violating its people's human rights. But with Pyongyang shunning diplomacy, there's little Seoul or anyone can do. This new freedom hasn't quenched Mr. Kim's fear. He worries about repercussions for speaking out. His baby daughter is only a month old. She gave Mr. Kim the final push to escape, to free her from what he calls a hellhole. Jean Mackenzie, BBC News in Seoul.
Now, golf balls are set to be modified to stop them from travelling so far when hit. The new rules will be introduced from 2028 because courses are too short to cope with the long distances golfers are increasingly hitting. Natalie Perks has been finding out more.
Nice hit.
Steve and his cousin Leon are battling the morning mist in Bromley. They've been playing together for years and admit they're no Tiger Woods.
Stop, stop, stop.
But new rules unveiled today will affect all players, no matter their level. From 2028 onwards, balls will gradually be swapped to new ones, which travel around 15 yards less for pros, but a mere 5 yards less for amateurs.
We don't hit anything like Bryson DeChambeau or Rory McIlroy, and I think it's a good choice because it makes it will make their golf more realistic.
In terms of watching the top professionals and the really good amateur players hit the ball a long way, I think that's always going to be an attraction.
On a cold, rain-soaked day, America retains the Ryder Cup.
Back in the day, golf courses were designed to challenge. But as golfers and technology got better, balls flew further. In 1980, only 6 professional golfers could hit the ball 270 yards from a tee shot. This year, Rory McIlroy's record average was more than 326 yards.
To keep challenging those big hitters, courses need extending, but that's expensive, not to mention environmentally damaging. So, after 5 years of grappling with these issues, the rule makers say it's a case of new balls, please.
Not everyone is happy. Ball manufacturers are miffed, and some pros have called the governing body out of touch. But speaking to me on his phone, three-time major winner Padraig Harrington said he agrees with the new rules.
So if you're at the top, you never want to change. You want to keep it where it is. Your winning formula genuinely helps the golf course. New and old, it really helps them both in terms of cost, sustainability, maintenance, safety.
So change is coming, no matter which side of the debate golfers land. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
Time for the weather now. Here's Simon King. Hi, Simon.
Rita, thanks so much indeed. We've got some freezing fog at the moment in Inverness Airport. Cold air is still in place here at the moment. But elsewhere, we've got rain spreading in. But as that rain starts to bump into that colder air in the northeast, we're starting to see a little bit of snow, primarily over the higher ground. But as we go through tonight, there could be some significant snow in central and northern areas of Scotland, becoming more confined to the higher ground as we go through the night, as that rain spreads north and east, becoming more patchy as we go into the early hours of tomorrow morning. For many of us, though, it's a frost-free night. We haven't seen that for quite a while, quite widely across the UK. Any snow should tend to clear away fairly quickly, turning back to rain here. And then we're going to see heavier rain spread its way in from the west. Look at those green colours, indicative of some really heavy downpours. And there'll be some strong winds around on Thursday, gales around the Irish Sea coast, severe gales in the northeast of Scotland. But that rain is bringing in that milder air. So temperatures in the west, 10, 12, 13 degrees Celsius in the southwest, elsewhere about 6 to 8 degrees. As we go through Thursday night, that rain will continue to move away to the east, but again, with a lot of rainfall falling, there could be some localised flooding, all linked into this area of low pressure, which keeps things pretty settled as we go into Friday. Showery outbreaks of rain spreading eastward. There might be some brighter or sunnier spells towards eastern and southeastern areas on Friday, with a few showers passing through. But again, temperatures will be up into double figures for many of us, even across some central and eastern areas as well. As we go into the weekend, it stays unsettled. It's not going to be a complete washout over the weekend. Some rain moving through, sunshine in between, some blustery winds. But look at that, temperatures about 9 to 14 Celsius.
Simon, thank you very much. And that is tonight's BBC News at 10. Newsnight is just getting underway on BBC Two, just started with Victoria, Derbyshire. On BBC One, it's time to join our colleagues for the news where you are. Good night.